I believe we actually ready to start. So for whoever just joined, a warm welcome. I'm Federica, part of the Docsity team, and we're just about to start our webinar. We will be talking about migration and climate change, and we are talking about this very important topic with Webster University Geneva. And I'm just going to introduce very briefly our panelists. We have Dina, Martina, Julia, and William connected. I just really don't want to steal much time. I can see, well, in the slide, very brief information, but I actually wanted to ask our panelists if they would like to briefly introduce themselves to all of you guys. Maybe we could start with Dina, and it's my pleasure to leave you the floor, and I'm just going to ask then Julia and Martina to do the same after. Thank you.
Thank you, Federica. Thank you so much. And hello to everyone across the world. That's so impressive to see all these names and all these locations appearing. So my name is Dina Ionescu, and my name, it's already a migrant name because initially it was Ionescu and it got Frenchicized in UNESCO when I moved from Romania as a child running away from the dictatorship to France. And I mentioned this, though it's quite personal, because I think that's at the heart of my interest and commitment to migration issues. It drives my work, and I had the chance to enter in 2004 in the International Organization for Migration, IOM, to work on sustainable development and migration issues, and slowly had the chance to move into much more the environment, climate change and migration, a whole story, which I got totally passionate about. I just finished my function as the head of the division in last August. I'm now in the process of having new functions that are being finalized, and also I engaged in collaboration with Webster University. Hence also my presence today, connected to the future master degree that is also introduced today. But I have an international background and very much into policies and a strong focus on migration with a climate twist to it. Thank you, Federica.
Thank you, Dina. I'm going to ask Julia actually the same question. So if you'd like to introduce yourself to us, thank you.
Sure, Federica, thank you so much. And I want to say, of course, thanks again to Webster University and to you for organizing this event, and also to Dina and Martina and William for joining me today. I'm very excited to be here to especially speak to students, as I understand many of the participants are students. And as a student and early career researcher myself, I'm very glad to have this opportunity to exchange. My name is Julia Blocher. I'm a researcher at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impacts Research and president of the International Youth Federation. And like Dina, I'm also a migrant. I am from the United States, as you may be able to tell from my accent. But I grew up in Geneva as a child and spent a lot of time traveling around different parts of Europe, mainly for my own studies. And within that, as a climate change activist for over a decade now, while I was studying in my master's, I began taking classes on human rights and refugee law and international law. And that was when it really hit me like a ton of bricks that the impacts of climate change are not only on the physical environment, but also on communities and people and their ability to enjoy a safe and dignified life. So I began also working on the issue of the linkages between climate change and human mobility, which I continue to do now. And now more specifically, the role of youth in that, because very often young people who are disproportionately affected. So thanks again for having me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Julia. And now it's Martina's turn. Welcome, Martina.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me and for organizing this very interesting event on such an important topic. So yeah, I'm Martina. I I'm currently Policy and Program Assistant at IOM, so UN Agency for Migration, and I was previously an intern at IOM in Geneva in the division focusing on migration, environment, and climate change. I'm also an alumni. Previous student. I was a student in international relations at Webster University. So happy to be back contributing to an event organized by my ex-university. And I I don't want to take too long, but my interest in migration, environment, and climate change was more of a gradual process. And I started with being interested in migration by volunteering with migrants and refugees when I moved to Geneva. And that was a very important experience. I think it really helped me, exposed me to such horrifying stories, but also stories of hope and opportunities and dreams. And then I had the chance to attend a presentation by actually IOM Migration, Environment, Climate Change Division on the linkages between migration and the environment, and that really sparked a lot of questions in me, and then I started researching more and more, and that's how I ended up kind of working more in that area, and being that's the origin of my interest, let's say. But thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you. And as you can see, we also have William, and will be available actually to answer any sort of question that you might have. You'll notice in the chat there is also a master degree that we will be talking about a little bit during the presentation. But in case you have any question while the presentation is going, please feel free, and William will be also available to answer any sort of questions. So actually starting to go a little bit deeper into our topic, again, I wanted to thank our speakers for introducing themselves. And, we understand that from the introduction, you actually bring different perspectives. So we've heard about policymaking, international advocacy, a more operational also aspect. So we actually wanted to ask each of you why you have engaged on these topics within this nexus of migration and climate change. So, wanted to know a little bit more about your passion, your experience. Maybe we could start with Dina, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you, Federica. I think it's very interesting to see that for me, I started working on development issues with another international organization, with the OECD, that it's based in Paris and deals with policies for better policies, for better results. And then I moved to IOM, that it's a very hands-on and very action-oriented, very operational organization as well. And then I really thought that today in our contemporary world, when I started working on migration around 2004, it was so bizarre that one of the key drivers of migration was a bit hidden still and not so much talked about. And this is the environmental drivers, understanding the degradation of the environment, issues of resources such as water resources and impacts on human mobility, understanding really issues on the very long term, like extreme heat, and where climate change impacts are driving, for instance, such different phenomena. Desertification, not enough water, or floods, too much water, or change in the oceans and acidification. So the wide range of hazards and of issues of environmental dimension were very often invisible. And then what was missing in my view as well was the connection between the environment and other areas, demography, jobs, employment issues, urban issues, food issues. So I think for me, what was very clear was that we cannot today speak of migration and human mobility and displacement dynamics and just forget the environment and just forget the impacts of climate change. So I had the chance to be in the organization at the moment where there was really an understanding of this and a will to put it forward strongly. So I had the chance to be in this generation in IOM that really led the change of giving visibility to environmental and climate change issues in connection to human mobility. So I think that that's, for me, two key issues. I also call this the double sensitivity challenge. It's very complicated to work on very political issues such as migration and on very complex and sensitive still issues around climate change. So it's almost a bit crazy, I think, to decide to really focus on migration and climate change, the double sensitivity challenge. But I think it's a must. It's a must. You cannot speak of migration and ignore this dimension. So that's at the heart of my engagement. And I've been working in an intergovernmental organization, so really with member states, with states, in partnership with the academia, with the civil society, with researchers, with artists. But the focus has also been in changing the narrative around migration to see the tragedy of people being displaced by disaster and climate change, but to see also the beauty and the opportunities and the positive dimensions of, for instance, migrants who contribute to climate action. So I had, this is my approach, an intergovernmental organization, a lot of work on defining data and evidence, a lot of partnership work, and a lot of work at policy level that then it's being operationalized by the organization.
Thank you so much, Dina. Actually, I would like to ask the same question to Julia and Martina, because each of you actually brings to the table a different perspective. Maybe Martina, you would like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I might have anticipated a bit this question in my previous, in my introduction, but so I decided to engage in MECs because, I mean, kind of as a consequence of me engaging in migration firsthand, and because I started to realize, as Dina was saying, the interconnectedness of things, and how, you know, there's not really one driver of migration. We cannot separate drivers, and I felt like this aspect, this driving force, was very often neglected, and you know, now, yeah, we're seeing this coming up more and more in international debates and in the media. But still, very often, I think it's it polarizes. It's very politicized, and we tend to associate it to extreme cases. So we tend to talk about, you know, climate refugees, and we still don't get, you know, the breadth of the scope of migration. I mean, that it's not just about the extreme cases. It's such a wide spectrum, and so I think that, and it starts in my, I started in my, like, very, you know, small environment in my, when I was at a university, when I was volunteering, even in my own family, you know, trying to raise awareness about this, that, you know, it's not like people are going to start invading us from countries affected by climate change. We're not talking about forced displacement only, but this is about, you know, opportunities, and it's much more. Yeah, I think that's, I don't know if I answered your question, but I went a bit on a tangent. But
no. You absolutely did. And as we anticipated, it's actually great to see that all of you are giving us a different perspective, and we really appreciate that. And Julia, we wanted to ask similar question to you. So what made you engaged on this topic?
Yes, thank you, Federica. So as mentioned before, I also kind of bridged into this topic from my role as a climate change activist, where before connecting climate change to human mobility was very mainstream. And I was engaged into this topic through my master's program and master's thesis. And I really started my career at the UN Refugee Agency at a time where the discussion on whether or not UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, would be in a position to protect people who are displaced as a result of natural hazard-induced disasters, whether internally inside of their own countries, which, as we know, is the vast majority of people displaced by disasters, or if there was ways to address protection gaps for people who may leave their countries. This debate has very much evolved since then, and I think today we have a rather consistent consensus amongst experts that most people stay within their home country, and those that cross is a minority, but would not be considered refugees in the sense of the UN Refugee Convention. However, there's a lot of discussion on how we could protect those people who do cross borders as well as those who stay within. And this is something that is actively discussed within the UNFCCC, largely within the framework of loss and damage, but is also really a topic that surrounds this UNFCCC negotiations. So I wanted to learn more about this topic. So I went back to school and started a PhD on this. And through my field work in mostly sub-Saharan Africa, but also in the Pacific, in Papua New Guinea and in Fiji, and also working with the International Organization for Migration, IOM, I came to the realization that the people who are most affected by climate change are also those who had the least to do with creating the problem in the first place. And by that, I mean communities in the Pacific, for example, that are rapidly losing the ability to remain on their ancestral land because of sea level rise and salinization and wave-related flooding, as well as young people who are in a generation now coming into working age, having contributed very little to global emissions that drive climate change, and yet looking at a future of having to deal with the impacts that we're already feeling now. So this is how my career trajectory brought me here, and why I joined the International Youth Federation, and then thankfully have become the president and am driving our role in bringing this issue to COP26 in Glasgow, working with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network of the UN on this issue, and trying to bring voices of young people, especially those who are affected by climate change, to the negotiators and also to practitioners within these conversations. So I hope that makes sense. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. Actually, Martina was mentioning the media. You just mentioned the COP26 Glasgow. I mean, definitely, I believe all of you involved into these issues have your own thoughts and ideas, but there is a lot of hype about these events. So I wanted to ask, I mean, you introduced also yourself as a researcher, so I wanted to ask a little bit about your perspective on this. So do you believe that for policymakers is actually clear, the link between migration and climate change? And what do you believe are the expectations on different sides? So what do you think should be the political priorities for such a big gathering? Thank you.
Yeah, happy to comment on that. But of course, when it comes to governmental thoughts, maybe Dina is also very well placed to answer the question. But it is interesting, I think, to see the level of ambition and energy of policymakers going into the COP this year as compared to others. Of course, it's difficult to really get into the minds of negotiators, especially considering the differences of opinions and positions between them is so vast and diverse. So what I think is an interesting way to consider this is through the summary from the chair that was recently published in the UNFCCC website, which is a summary of discussions amongst ministers in the pre-conference ahead of the COP26, which was held in Milan last month. And what I found really interesting about this was, first of all, that they really highlight, as I think they should, the role of youth and the engagement of youth. As you may know, before this, or actually in tandem with this pre-conference in Milano, there was a so-called Youth COP, Youth for Climate Driving Ambition event, at which almost 400 young people from 186 countries discussed what they would want governmental officials to focus on at the COP. And they focused on youth driving ambition, sustainable recovery, engaging NGOs, and also the expectations of youth. So after receiving this information from the youth, the ministers at this pre-conference discussed a number of important issues, and I can't highlight all of them, but I did want to just highlight a few that all kind of come under what I would think of as a heading of closing the gap between the current trajectory that the world is on and the commitments made in the Paris Agreement, and at the same time, closing the gap between the trajectory that those commitments would put us on and what the science actually says the trajectory that we should be on in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So as we know, the difference between 1.5 degrees warming and 2 or 3 or even 4 degrees warming, which is still a possibility given our current trajectory, is night and day. If we were to exceed 2 degrees warming with respect to pre-industrial levels, we would be living in a world that humans simply did not succeed in previously. We didn't evolve in this type of environment. So in order to rebalance the trajectories that we're on, the ministers in this meeting, and also what is relayed in this summary, was the need to go back to the science and look at how can we be on the correct goal, pathway to achieve the 1.5 degree temperature goal. Emphasize also that countries that have not developed nationally determined contributions or national adaptation plans should do so. And importantly, they discussed the completion of the Paris rulebook, which would be addressing the kind of lack of transparency of the reporting and follow-up on commitments made in the Paris Agreement. And then what I think is very important that youth also mentioned for this conversation is the issue of loss and damage, and how to really now go from understanding the issue of loss and damage to taking action on it. So I do think that amongst government officials in general, but especially amongst the negotiators at these climate conferences, that the understanding of the links between climate change and migration and displacement is quite high. But of course, each country has a different experience of it. Countries from maybe small island states in the Pacific, for them, it's truly an existential question that in a matter of decades, people may not be able to adapt in place where they have been living for generations any longer. That's a very different understanding of the issue or understanding of the urgency of the issue than other countries that may not be experiencing similar effects, or at least not yet. So I think that, again, there is a gap between where we are and what the science says. And this is also true for the issue of climate change and human mobility. But it's really encouraging to me to see loss and damage addressed directly in this chair's summary, which means that there's a growing awareness and a growing understanding. Thank you so much. Sorry for taking so much time.
No, thank you, Julia. When you actually were answering the question, you also mentioned that Dina has some experience into this. So I wanted actually to take advantage of asking Dina. I mean, you're very familiar with the aspect of long-term policy making and more technical aspects of this negotiation. So I wanted to ask, what are the main issues at hand? So what kind of topics are actually covered?
Yes, thank you. So it takes time indeed it's a very strange experience to go to the negotiations and to the COPs. And in fact, very often you are not part of the negotiations. And there is also a gap sometimes between the negotiators and everything that goes on around the COPs. But I think what is extremely interesting is to see where we stand today, looking just slightly back. So there have been 16 climate conferences without any mention of migration. And migration came through the push of some champion countries, in particular, as Julia mentioned, also countries very vulnerable to climate change, like small island states. And it was pushed also by a whole community of practice that was made of researcher, policymaker, international organizations such as IOM, where the idea was also to bring the social dimension of climate change. So it's not just migration issues, but also health, and most importantly, human rights issues in the debate. So to bring issues, the human dimension into the scientific dimension. And I think migrants are a bit the face, the image, the visible part of this social dimension and human dimension of climate change. So in a way, speaking of migration facilitates a broader set of issues around social and human dimension and climate change. So there were 16 COPs with no mention of migration. And I'm calling this, in fact, 3 stages in the COPs around migration that can explain where we stand today. The first phase is the first A. It's A for absence, unfortunately. The second phase was A for anchorage. So after 15 COPs, I think we really have an advance in terms of anchoring human mobility issues in the negotiated text. So you have Cancun text on adaptation, then you had the Warsaw mechanism on loss and damage that looked then at human mobility from the loss and damage perspective. And then the Paris Agreement recognized the migrants' migrants' rights in its preamble and established a task force on displacement under this executive committee of the Warsaw Mechanism on Loss and Damage. And I had the chance to be in this task force since 2016 till 2021. There are 13 members in the task force from international organizations and also other parts of groups such as the least developed countries or the adaptation group. And also they are led by states, of course, under the executive committee on the Warsaw Mechanism. So this was the time of anchorage, was to negotiate text that speaks of migration, and it's the text at the Paris Agreement, but also it's connected to what happened on the migration side with the Global Compact on Migration that recognized in turn climate issues. So you have the two sides of a coin, the migration policy recognizing climate change issues and the climate change policy recognizing migration issues. So this brings us to the third time of this, that I very optimistically, I saw that there are pessimists and optimists, but from a very optimistic side, I call this the A for action. So we have A for absence, A for anchorage, and A for action, because that's what's at stake now with this COP. And the COPs are a long-term process. Of course, there's one shot event, and it's important one because it was moved from last year to this year. So we are behind schedule. But this year, the key questions are about how you transform this anchorage into action. And that's when you say also, what are the expectations of policymakers? I think that's the key question from many sides that we saw at IOM. What does it mean concretely to speak of migration in the context of climate change? And that's why you have so many different entry points that are key now. So to just quote a few, you have really in the Task Force on Displacement on Loss and Damage, issues of slow onset, issues of insurance, issues of how you can invest in climate actions so that there is less and fewer losses and fewer damages. So seeing migration also as part of the solution in a very ironic way, in a way, to look at loss and damage and to look at migration and part of the solution. You have very concrete ways of supporting states to work on their national adaptation plans with understanding migration issues, forced displacement issues, how you facilitate pathways of migration to avoid tragic forms of migration. You have very concrete capacity building dimension, for instance, the Santiago network on capacity building on loss and damage, where it's about practitioners, supporting practitioners in their activities to enhance their capacities to be able to respond to the challenges of climate change. You have issues really in Glasgow on finance and how we can support countries most vulnerable to climate change to access climate finance for human mobility migration type of activities. You have a very concrete gender dimension, indigenous dimension, and then you have multiple entry points. We can speak of oceans, acidification impacts on migration on fishermen communities. You speak on desertification issues or deforestation impacts on indigenous population, nomadic population, concrete issues of conflict then with agriculture population, and you become again super concrete. You can speak of ecosystem, a nature-based solution. You can speak of migrants, diasporas facilitating their investments in water management. You can speak of clean energy being delivered to people who are displaced by natural hazard, for instance, by a floods or another event. So I think it's very important to see that there are very concrete ways to speak about migration, to look in also the question of resilience, and to really look at migration in its negative force compelled dimensions and what can be done to protect and support people and enhance capacities of countries most vulnerable to climate change to respond to the challenges, and to see the very positive adaptative dimension of migration as part of the solution, and how you can support diasporas and migrants to invest themselves as well into climate action. So I think the COP has these both dimension, and there is a very strong focus also on climate change and human rights, which I think is key. It might be less obvious in terms of what it means, but in fact, it's the backbone. It's the heart of the whole issue.
Thank you so much, Dina. Julia actually was talking about youth engagement. Beginning of our session, we actually asked if you believe that this is important, and I believe over 80% actually said yes. So we saw news from Milan a few weeks ago. So actually wanted to ask Martina, how can younger people, students, young professionals, all of the people that are actually connected today, how can be influential here on this topic?
Yes, thank you, Federica. Well, there are many ways that they can get involved. I mean, I would say, well, first you can start local. It doesn't need to be anything big, but if you're passionate about something, you can, influence your environment, your social networks. So people around you, just talk about this with your friends, with your family. I would say if you're you know, at university, doing your master's, your undergrad, just join a group. When I was at Webster, I was in a humanitarian association. I then, became the president, and you know, you can do a lot in your, you know, small context, and you know, you can. It's rewarding because you can see the change you're making. So you don't get too frustrated by, you know, aiming at changing the world, but you start little, but that, you know, adds up. So I would say, yes, join groups, like advocacy groups inside your university. You can start some if they're not already there. Volunteer at events. If you're in Geneva or any other big cities, I'm sure you can find opportunities to volunteer. In Geneva, yeah, there are just plenty. There's the international, you know, film festival, and there are documentaries on the interlinkages between migration and climate change at this festival as well. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International have all, you know, all great organizations to volunteer for, and they just give you, they all tackle some from different angles this issue. And yeah, I think just look at around you really, and yeah, like starting local, I think it's always the best way.
Thank you, Martina. So we actually started Glasgow, we mentioned Milan, you actually mentioned Geneva, and you know, we are our co-host for this webinar. Webster University has a campus in Geneva. So you actually already started to mention some of the greatest activities that are around this city. I wanted to take the opportunity maybe also to ask Dina, why Geneva is considered a primary location for negotiation, policy, and diplomacy on climate change and migration. So if you can give also a different insight, and also Martina started to talk a little bit about this.
Yes, thank you, Federica. I think that Geneva, like New York, are really capitals of multilateralism. And in our contemporary time, I think multilateralism is key, in particular for migration issues. What is very particular about Geneva now is that you have this hub of organizations that are really talking of the migration and climate change topic, that it's at the heart of our discussion today. So you have the community on migration and human mobility with big agencies like the refugee, UNHCR, the Migration Agency, IOM. You have a platform on disaster displacement that it's a state-led initiative. You have an internal displacement monitoring center that it's one of the key data actor on internal displacement issues. You have the Red Cross and the IFRC. So you have a lot of the organization. ILO as well works a lot on migration, that deal with migration and have this attachment to climate issues. And then you have the hub of all the environmental and sustainable development actors. You have the United Nations Environment Organization. You have the World Meteorological Organization that hosts also the key IPCC, so that the key actor on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that gives the data and evidence on this topic. You have IUCN on ecosystems and biodiversity. You have WWF. You have the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is also a state-led initiative that brings together countries most vulnerable to climate change. Then you have different waste, pollution, deforestation initiatives, that are also in Geneva. You have the Global Alliance on Clean Energy also in Geneva. So it's a hub for environmental players and also amazing hub of civil society representative. You have Zoe International, you have local associations that are environmentally focused, you have Initiative of Change, you have CARE, the International Institution for Institute for Sustainable Development. It's really very lively community of practice, and then that's why I think also Webster it's ideally placed. It has already this long-term connection to this international whole community that's here in Geneva, and plus of course you have the diplomatic representation of national states that are the multilateral diplomatic missions of the states, and who follow also, for instance, very importantly, the Human Rights Council that also addresses this dimension from its perspective. So I think it's a very particular and amazing field to deep dive into this topic by being connected to this international whole life that it's the heart beating on the discussion on this today.
Thank you. Wanted just to take a minute just to thank all of you for your questions. We received lots of questions, which is great, and we try to do our best to answer some of them just at the end of the presentation. I mean, Gina, you mentioned Webster Geneva. We have also connected William, Director of Admissions at Webster. And at the beginning, we also mentioned that there is a specific master, is a new master, migration, climate change, and environment. So we mentioned how important it is for youth to get involved, to students, and also maybe, you know, invest into education, how could it make a difference. I wanted really just to spend a couple of minutes maybe to talk about this program, maybe who is designed for, and how actually it can help shaping, you know, people that are interested into this topic, as we can see that lots of people connected also think that is important to get involved. So maybe I don't know if Dina, and also the support of William.
I can say a few words, and of course, William, please jump in. For me, I think the vision I see for this new master degree is, first of all, that these are such important issues that we need to prepare a new generation of practitioners to be able to address them. And that also the knowledge we have on this topic has so much grown over the last 20, 15 years. We are at such a different point that now we need very specific programs to be able to address this correctly. Then I think the vision for it, it's really a vision of cross-disciplinary approach, because as soon as you speak of migration, you speak of migration and something else. And then here we are at the heart of this and by connecting migration and climate change. So it's cross-disciplinary. It means it's a program, I think, that's meant for people who are environmentalists as much as social policy people, about it's for people who work on migration, people who work on sustainability, very concrete technical issues. I think it goes across social issues, even health. I saw some questions were also looking at the impact of COVID on all this whole topic, and I think it's something that it's at the heart of our reflection. What do we learn from this pandemic as well in terms of this very complex topic, and that we need to address coherently issues. So I think it's also very important for human rights practitioners to be able to be trained in this particularly. So there's this vision of the multidisciplinarity, the vision of being time that it's needed now because of the way we advance on this topic. And lastly, for me, I think what's key is to have a program that's connected to International Geneva, that's connected to professional life, that it's connected to the discussions that are being held at the professional international level, so that people arrive already prepared and connected through internships, through exchanges, through a permanent ping pong between the professional world and the academic world. So to have it like a very nice circle, virtuous circle, where this evidence feeds in the professional world, and then what you learn from the professional world in terms of policy and operation feeds back into this academic education and knowledge.
Thank you. William, I just wanted to ask if you wanted to add a couple of words before jumping into the Q&A. And again, thank you all for all of your questions. They're super interesting.
Thank you so much. I think just on behalf of the university, thank you again to Julia, Martina, and Dina for joining us and for hosting Federica. For all of you who asked questions in the Q&A, I don't want to take too much time because I saw some fantastic questions. And it just reminds me that there's a need for this kind of program that provides knowledge about the policy-making process and so forth, but also about the science, where to get information, how to connect to the experts. And as Dina mentioned, we need a new generation of people who are graduating from university prepared to take leadership positions, even as younger people, in these organizations, in some of the movements that are happening, whether it's at the World Health Organization, whether it's in any of these different organizations in Geneva, or even beyond in the regions. As Martina said, there's so much that can be done locally. So I won't take more other than to thank everyone for their interest in the topic. I also want to encourage Julia, if you have an opportunity. Martina did answer the question about how young people can get involved, and I imagine you have something to say about that too. So I want to make sure Julia has a chance to chime in there. And yeah, we'll be sure that all of those who joined today have access to the website for more details.
Thank you, Julia. I leave you the floor to answer this very important question that we faced together.
Yes, thank you for throwing it back to me. I really do appreciate it. And I absolutely agree with what Martina said, and which is in essentially start local. And I think that this is what is very often a successful path for youth who want to be involved in issues that are important to them and affect them in their communities. I find in general that if you're engaged in an issue that you feel passionate about and that also affects you personally, your long-term impact tends to be greater. Also, I can encourage everyone to check out what we're doing at the International Youth Federation. We are a network of youth organizations and work in 50 countries around the world. And our goal really is to amplify the work of youth that they're already involved in. So we do some projects, but we also are really trying to serve as a platform for youth and the contributions that they already make. And I think this is also our goal for being part of the COP, and also, of course, webinars like this, is to help connect people to young people, to other young people that are doing similar work, so that they can multiply their impact, connect to funders, raise awareness, raise visibility for their issues, and make a bigger impact than they can alone in most cases. But I do think it's very important that youth continue to be involved in these issues. Of course, I think the climate change issue in particular is something that young people are very engaged in because it so impacts them and their futures. But it is also, in a very optimistic sense, that I feel an issue that youth really have a huge amount of leverage and are really taken very seriously in the governmental discussions in their own countries and also in the international forums that are provided, like through the UNFCCC. So there's youth delegations at the COP. There's a lot of work going on through the UN Major Group for Children and Youth. There's the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which the International Youth Federation is also part of. There are a lot of ways for youth to break through on this issue, and governments, in fact, want to hear from youth on this issue. So I really encourage young people to be on their social networks, to maintain their optimism, because that's what a lot of a lot of governments also want to hear from young people is that they're hopeful and feel that there's more to be done and are willing to put in the work and push others to put in the work as well. So I encourage everyone to, again, check us out at the International Youth Federation, get on your social media networks during the COP already now, and really let your voices be heard.
Thank you. And actually, Dina just posted on the chat. I'm just going to add a comment. There is a portal that you can actually find lots of information on this topic. So thank you so much, Dina, for sharing this with us. Actually, now is really time to answer to some of your questions. Thanks again. I can see Julia already started to answer to some, which is great. Thank you so much. One of the questions is about expectations. So we talked a little bit during our session. So is there an effort to establish a uniform international code and regulation for migrants, or it's actually an unrealistic expectation? I don't know, like to go first, maybe Dina, I can see you're nodding if you like to start. And of course, Julia, Martina, if you'd like to add anything, feel free.
Yes, I think, and I will post also a link to that can help also responding to this question. I think it's very important to see that over the past year, there has been a lot of discussion at international level about this. And I think, in my view, the Global Compact on migration, on regular, safe and orderly migration, it's one of the responses of the international community to having a more unified approach. You have other very interesting initiatives like the Nansen Protection Agenda that was adopted in 2015, looking at protection gaps for people crossing a border because of disaster displacement or climate change longer term impacts. I think from everything I saw from my work with IOM at policy level, there is no one single solution. I think there is a wide variety of responses to this question and the issues around migration in the context on climate change. So one single unified response, I don't think it's necessary, the response, and I don't think it will happen as such. You have a myriad of different approaches. And if you read the Global Compact on Migration, it provides very advanced language on different ways. You have responses through protection for visa issues, entry and stay, protection that's temporary, humanitarian protection. You have promoting regular pathways. You have actions that have to be taken at regional level. For instance, regional free movement protocols to better factor in my environmental and disaster and climate change dimensions. I really think that we cannot expect one single response. And if we focus too much also on this climate refugee kind of approach, I think we end up sometimes with the opposite of what we are really willing to do. We might end up by boxing people in very narrow categories instead of having a much wider, innovative vision of how to make migration a choice, how to make it dignified, how to make it regular, how to make it work for people. So for me, yes, not one single response for sure. And I think difficulties to have a unified one response at policy level, but loads of different possible approaches and solutions that can be promoted through dialogues and through collaboration and through regional approaches in particular.
Thank you. I could see that Julia was actually answering a question, so I might wanted to ask you, so it could be useful for all of us. There is a question about, someone from South Asia asking if you believe that you see the future of South Asia in terms of climate based on migrants and refugees. So what you can actually try to predict in terms of this.
To me for this one? So I was answering
because I saw you actually were starting to type, so I thought just took the occasion to read it to you.
Yes, absolutely. So the question from, I think, Fatima was about how Asia in general is very often put up as the region of the world that is most affected by climate change, which is, I think, related to early reports, especially in the media, about sea level rise in small island states and how this affects the territorial existence of this country. But I also wanted to add to this that for some years now, according to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, which again is a Geneva-based think tank, South Asia, or the Asia Pacific region overall, is usually the region with the highest number of people displaced by natural hazard-induced disasters every year. So by that, I mean people who are fleeing their homes because of cyclones and flooding and things like that. And last year alone, that was more than 12 million people just in the East Asia and Pacific region. So it's very much the case that this region is disproportionately affected for a number of reasons that are not just because of poverty and other reasons why people are vulnerable in this region, but also biophysical reasons. There's the Pacific Rift. There's a number of reasons why cyclones are very severe in this region, and other things like that. Also, because of population growth in the region and the low average age of many of these countries, it's likely that this will continue, that this region will still be disproportionately affected by disasters in the future. But we have higher population growth in sub-Saharan Africa, and so maybe in the future this will no longer be the case. But that's just about people who are displaced by disasters. I also wanted to point out that when it comes to migration, of course, we don't have really good information about people who are migrating in this region because of climate change impacts, but we're doing more and more to understand this. At the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impacts Research, where I work, we recently published a report that highlights mobility in the Philippines and in the Pacific region, which is relatively understudied as compared to some other areas of the world. And what we found is that a lot of people are migrating towards urban areas because of drought and other reasons why agricultural activities are failing. And so we think that this will be also an important issue in the future. But again, we don't have we need to improve the data and research on this. But I would point Fatima and others to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center and also to a recent report of the Asian Development Bank that addresses exactly this topic of climate change related migration in Asia and the Pacific. So I'll put that link in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Julia. Could Ilonga just ask us, so perceive that we as humans are very financial driven, and how to engage governments, especially in the sub-Saharan countries, to take the necessary action when they don't see any fast financial return. So, of course, it's very hard to try to give an answer, but what is your opinion on this in terms of like how to engage the government to actually take an action, although there might not be a return in terms of money or investment? Dina or Martina, if you want just to help us answer, as I said, it's not easy.
Yes, it's a tough question, and there are loads of tough questions because, in fact, this is a very complicated and complex topic. And it brings me back also to the question of being pessimistic or optimistic. You know, we can look at this both ways because humanity is capable of the best and of the worst. And we have to go ahead even with this topic by accepting this. And a lot of the questions and the question you also asked are very difficult questions because they are long-term change issues and they touch upon inequalities, poverty, lack of human rights, respect, questions of corruption. These are very complex issues that, of course, we cannot just solve and address like this. I think it's not a call, nevertheless, to stop doing. It's the contrary. I think realizing all these difficulties only can push us to try to once again educate and train people to be able to address the complexity. And for me, as soon as you work on climate change and migration issues, you need to be very nuanced and to understand the complexities and to look at this wide range of solutions that I mentioned before. So I think there are solutions that are about more youth investment, more civil society investment, working more closely with the private sector, working closely with chambers of commerce, investing in capacities, for instance, to support countries that are in difficulty to access the funds, but then find very strong guards of how the money is then used and evaluation of the projects and of the programs. These are very complex issues, but my call is not to believe that we can't do anything and to not look at it. I think you can't look at it like a huge mountain as the Everest and got on the top of the Everest from the first moment. You have to do camp 1, camp 2, camp 3, camp 4, camp 5. I don't know how many you have to get up the Everest or the Mont Blanc. We have the Mont Blanc behind us in the picture. So I think it's about being realistic that you won't cope with the whole thing, but you'll have to work step by step, grade by grade, brick by brick, block by block into creating solutions. And yeah, that's what I would say. Then for Sub-Saharan Africa, there are very particular difficult challenges. We have awful projections in terms of extreme heat and desertification. We have issues around the use of resources. And I think if you want to look, for instance, in IOM's programs in the Sahel and in the Horn of Africa, in the region where there are connection between migration and climate change, you will find also very different programs. Some are for returnees to return back with land management programs. Some are for support to nomadic populations so that they can continue to move with their herds. Some will be about investment in the environment to curb the desertification trends and to support people to maintain their livelihoods. Other are about the protection of people being displaced. Each time you will find a range of activities and projects that address bits and pieces of this major, big Everest of issues.
Thank you. So we actually coming toward the end of our evening.
That might be, yes, I was just going to add that perhaps that was a good point that Dina raised, that it feels like an Everest or a mountain of issues. This is a good reason why we're encouraging people to think about going back for additional learning, whether it's for a short course, for a degree program, or any training that's available, simply because the more you're able to learn and acquire the skills and competencies and awareness of how it affects the type of work you're doing, whether you're in engineering, whether you're in politics, whether you're an advocate who's doing communications work. That's the kind of aspiration we have for the new master's degree, is that people will be joining us from many different backgrounds, from many academic trainings. So it's not a program only for people who studied political science or international relations, but rather to bring people together from healthcare, from science backgrounds, from political science, from communications, because everybody has a role to play in putting together what would be the right kind of campaign for change.
Thank you, William, and I totally agree. I mean, investing in education and really could make a difference. And as mentioned, we will be sending you an email after this event. You will have all the information related to this master program. You can, reach out. There will be a link to the website. But before closing the session, I really wanted to thank our speakers. And there are lots of questions that maybe we didn't have time to get through today, but wanted to ask asked Julia, Dina, Martina, and also William if there was something else that you wanted to add, like an encouragement. And we said, you know, some of the people that are listening were very optimistic or pessimistic, but just wanted to ask, you know, final word, something that can take back from this session today. Maybe starting with Martina, and then I'm going to ask each of you if you wanted to add anything to what has been said. Thank you.
Oh, it's really hard to summarize, I think, this discussion in one message. But I think if there's one thing, I'm probably like speaking to other like students and young people, I would say think try to see connections between things, do as many experiences as you can that can broaden your horizons and help you see connection between things. Because then I think one of the greatest problems that we have in many areas is that people think in silos from their field of expertise, and they don't see links between issues. And you know, climate change and migration is just one example, but I do think that the more experiences you can make, and the more you can learn about different disparate topics, that will enrich you and help you to make connections and contribute to society even more in a positive way.
Thank you so much, Martina. I wanted also to ask similar thing to Julia, and again, thanking her for her time for being here.
Sure, thank you so much again, Federica, and also to Martina, Dina, and William for joining today. Yes, I think I would echo what was said about learning. I'm a student myself. I think it's good to keep learning throughout life, whether you're doing that through degree certification or something which I'm very much supportive of at IYF is peer-to-peer support mechanisms and peer-to-peer trainings, or perhaps volunteer opportunities where you have experiential learning. These are things that I think can help develop one personally and then ultimately contribute to community around you. So very happy to be in touch with anyone who wants to find me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and continue this conversation later. And thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Julia. Dina, your turn. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you also to all panelists and all people who attended the seminar. From my side, I would come back to the question you posed at the beginning, maybe as the key message. It's the making a difference. I think for me, it's clear that absolutely each individual can make a difference. And even working in huge organizations, you can be at individual level strongly making a difference and an impact. And for me, making a difference means so many different things. It can be being an advocate. It can be working in the private sector in connection to this topic. It can be really impacting at policy level. For me, it's super concrete. I know for many people working on policies, it's not concrete at all. It's only concrete if you really help people in need, for instance. But for me, I think investing into working at policy level makes a difference on the longer term, in particular in terms of migration issues. I think you can make a difference by your investing in research, working on data, working on publication. I think you can make a huge difference by working in the media on this topic and going beyond the usual narratives, going beyond a caricatural approach to this very complex topic. I think you can make a difference by educating your own kids with respect for migrants and respect for the environment and for nature. So I think that's the key thing. Making a difference can take all these dimensions in relation to the topic we discussed today. And education, of course, in my view, it's at the heart of absolutely everything. Education from the creche to to the PhD, and everything in between. And that's why also I think that creating a new program on this topic, it's very courageous and timely and maybe a bit crazy, but I really believe it's totally needed.
Thank you. And while thanking the Webster University Geneva and William for giving us the opportunity really to talk about those issues, I wanted to ask William if there was anything else they wanted to add.
Again, just a big thank you to all the participants with the great questions, to all of our panelists, as you've done. I think it was Dina, but someone had mentioned that migrants have become the face of the human dimension of climate change. And this all brings this to light. I think for those who attended, all the participants, the world needs your talents, your contributions, your motivation makes a difference. Whether you're coming at this issue thinking about marginalized communities in your home country, whether you're coming at this issue from the perspective of human rights or from the science perspective or from the perspective of being a champion for communications through social media, trying to make a difference. Continue to find ways to connect, as Martina said, to engage, whether it's through studies, whether it's through sharing your passion and knowledge that you're learning along the way with people that you know. And don't hesitate to just follow the news and to share with people how important you believe these issues are. Because as Martina said, thinking about how things are connected is probably what the master's level is all about. At the bachelor level, we learn many disciplines, but at the master's level, it's very often learning how to connect those disciplines that really makes a difference. And I think it makes for fascinating careers. It makes for careers that ultimately have the impact to influence in the world. So we invite you, of course, to take a closer look at our master's program, but anything you can do to advance your own interests and
Thank you. So really thanks so much for our panelists for being with us today, and for all of you for being connected. Your questions were absolutely great. We will be sending out an email with some extra information. The session was recorded, so in case you want to watch it again, just because maybe you want to take more attention to some of the answer we provided you with, absolutely, you will have the opportunity. Once again, thanks for all. I'm just going to share in the chat a link in case you'd like to receive a certificate for attending the session. And we look forward to seeing you soon at the next live webinar of Webster University Geneva. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Everyone.